The Second World War was at a crossroads. The Eastern Front had turned into a brutal chessboard where the greatest air forces fought for control. At this point, the German Colossus had tasted bitter defeat at Stalingrad, a setback that began to erode its aura of invincibility. On the other side of the board, the Red Army, though weakened, was growing in strength and audacity amid this turbulent panorama. Influential figures were in command, making strategic decisions that would shape the fate of Germany and the world. Adolf Hitler, the Führer, was trying to gather his forces to return to his grand vision of dominating Europe. His powerful and determined personality was matched only by his stubbornness, which increasingly ignored the advice of his military commanders. On the opposite side, Soviet strategists such as Joseph Stalin were gathering their forces for a decisive counterattack. The unyielding leader of the USSR had resisted the initial German assault and was now preparing his troops. His leadership was marked by cruelty and pragmatism, willing to sacrifice thousands to achieve strategic goals. The Eastern Front was characterized by a mosaic of fiercely contested territories, most notably Kursk. This seemingly harmless bulge in the front lines became a potential strategic point where the Germans sought to regain momentum. Considering it a weak spot, they planned a devastating pincer attack that could encircle and destroy substantial Soviet forces. On the other hand, the Soviet leadership, strengthened by its intelligence network and the advice of skilled generals such as Marshal Georgy Zhukov, perceived the potential trap. They understood that the Germans might target this salient and began preparations for a defense in depth that would exhaust German forces as tension mounted with the arrival of spring. The stage was set for an epic clash of military power, where strategic buildup would be tested to its limits. Neither side knew it yet, but their decisions were leading them to the largest tank battle in history. Operation Citadel, Hitler's bold attempt to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Recent research reveals that the Soviets suffered shockingly high casualties, up to 6 times more men and equipment. Yet, why did the Germans lose this historic battle? Hitler believed that if the Anglo-Americans failed to open a second front in France, he would have the opportunity to strike the USSR decisively. His priority was to lure the Red Army into a battle of attrition, weakening it to prevent any significant offensive in 1943. This was crucial, for at the time, the Red Army outnumbered the Wehrmacht in the east in manpower, 2.1 to 1, tanks, 4.6 to 1, and artillery, 3.1 to 1. It is November 1942. Hitler and members of his staff are traveling to Munich aboard his personal train. In the early years of the war, Hitler commanded his troops and held staff conferences aboard this special train, which moved from place to place along the front, a kind of mobile headquarters. Normally, when the train stopped and he saw people, he would go to the window, wave, and, of course, he loved public relations. He enjoyed being among the people. He was truly a public figure. However, upon arriving at a station, Hitler encounters a grim scene. Next to his train, he spots another, essentially a cattle car, filled with soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. They are disheveled, their uniforms filthy, some wounded. They see their Führer, the man for whom they had risked their lives, to whom they had devoted their service. This seems to be the moment for Hitler to offer inspiring words to these severely wounded warriors. Yet, instead of greeting them in any way, he simply stares at them with contempt, turns away, and instructs his servant to close the blinds so he would not have to see them. As the Third Reich faces collapse, Hitler needs a victory at any cost. He urgently requires a triumph. He desperately needs to halt the Red Army's advance and reclaim the initiative. This is Hitler's last chance. With his armies in constant retreat on the Eastern Front, the Führer is immersed in intense agitation. Hitler's state of mind after Stalingrad is noticeably worse than before. Suddenly, he had faced his first major defeat of the war, leaving him genuinely nervous and humiliated, unable to envision the continuation of the conflict. As Hitler's nerves fray, his ability to lead comes into question. Among the high-ranking generals, some no longer consider him the greatest commander of all time. He had stopped listening to his generals, convinced that he was always right. A disaster for a supreme commander. His conferences became rambling sessions, sometimes pacing in circles for 15 to 20 minutes. Heinrich Himmler, commander of the SS and chief architect of the Nazi concentration camp system, began to question Hitler's abilities. But now, if Hitler wishes to reclaim his title as the greatest war commander and restore his power in the East, he desperately needs a victory against the Red Army. After the defeat at Stalingrad and Hitler's deteriorating mental state, the Nazi propaganda machine went into action. The man responsible for keeping German morale high was the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was a genius of propaganda, and in a way, he was the brain behind the Third Reich. He was the one who translated Hitler's message for the general public. After the massive defeat in the city of Stalin, Goebbels reiterated 3 themes in his speech. 1. If the Wehrmacht was not in a position to counterattack the danger coming from the Eastern Front, the German Reich would fall to Bolshevism and the rest of Europe soon after. 2. The Wehrmacht, the German people, and the Axis powers alone had the strength to save Europe from this threat. 3. The danger was imminent, and Germany needed to act quickly and decisively. In his speech, Goebbels elaborated extensively on what Nazi propaganda claimed was the threat posed by the so-called international Jewry. The goal of Bolshevism is the worldwide Jewish revolution. They want to bring chaos to the Reich and to Europe, using the resulting despair to establish their international capitalist tyranny disguised as Bolshevism. By rejecting the protests of enemy nations against the Reich's Jewish policies, he declared, amid thunderous applause from the audience, that Germany intends to take the most radical measures, if necessary, in due time. While Goebbels referred to the Soviet mobilization across the nation as diabolical, he explained that we cannot overcome the Bolshevik danger unless we employ equivalent, though not identical, methods in a total war. He then justified the austerity measures that had been enacted, presenting them as temporary measures. Historically, the speech is important because it marks the first admission by the leadership of the Nazi Party that they were facing problems, and it launched the mobilization campaign that arguably prolonged the war. Goebbels declared that no German was thinking of any kind of compromise, and instead that the entire nation is thinking only of a hard war. Goebbels tried to counter reports in the Allied press that German civilians had lost faith in victory by asking the audience a few questions at the end, such as, "Do you believe, with the Führer and with us, in the ultimate total victory of the German people? Are you and the German people willing to work, if the Führer commands it, 10, 12, and if necessary 14 hours a day and give everything for victory? Do you want a total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can imagine today?" It is March 1943, 2 months after the defeat at Stalingrad, and a golden opportunity presents itself. After a successful German counterattack in the city of Kharkov, in the southwest of the USSR, a salient was formed in the Soviet front line. Stretching approximately 250 kilometers from north to south, at its center lies the city of Kursk. This salient is so large that it is almost the distance between São Paulo and Ribeirão Preto. Grouped around the Kursk salient are 5 large Soviet armies, containing more than 1 million enemy soldiers. The plan is to deliver a decisive blow to the Russian army, which is concentrating massive forces in this Kursk salient. And if the Germans can manage to isolate them, it will show the world that Germany is not finished. But to guarantee victory, the German invasion of the Kursk salient must be swift. However, the German plan has a fatal flaw. They gravely underestimate Soviet strength. Including reserves, the Red Army has 2.6 million men, 8,900 tanks and self-propelled vehicles, 5,900 aircraft, and 47,400 pieces of artillery and mortars that can be thrown into the battle. The Soviets have also introduced new heavy weapons systems, such as the Su-122 and Su-152 self-propelled guns. The purges of 1937 in the army led by Stalin had left a weak and poorly led force by the beginning of 1941. However, the army was undergoing a reorganization when the Germans launched their attack in June of that year, catching the Red Army by surprise. The initial German advance penetrated deeply into the Russian rear areas. In many cases, the Germans found themselves advancing eastward while also defending westward, as retreating Russians caught up with them. There seemed to be no effective organization or control over the mass of Russian soldiers in the early stages. However, when the first winter set in, the first signs appeared that things were not going the way Hitler had expected. Better adapted to the climate and terrain, the Russian army quickly launched its first offensive, which nearly succeeded in overwhelming the German army. The main disadvantage for the Red Army was the constant interference of political commissars who instilled fear in every soldier. Often, commanders were reluctant to make crucial decisions without clear instructions from higher ranks, directly affecting the course of battles and contributing to some of the Red Army's defeats. The Russian soldier was also dealing with new tactics employed by the Germans. Moreover, the Red Army faced many supply problems and the loss of vital industrial regions, and the relocation of factories farther east hit production hard. As the war progressed, the Red Army became better equipped and more capable of dealing with the superior skills of the German army. The sheer weight in numbers, both of men and materials, was beginning to turn the tide in their favor. While Hitler and Manstein planned the Battle of Kursk in Moscow, Hitler's enemy, Joseph Stalin, is feeling triumphant after winning the Battle of Stalingrad, his first major victory since the beginning of the war. The battle may have been won, but the war in the east is far from over. With large parts of southwestern Russia still under German occupation, Stalin is determined to reclaim what is his. But to have any hope of success, he must face the fatal flaws of his army. In the early stages of the war, Russia was unprepared. They lacked troops and equipment, they were unready for mobilization, and this resulted in their defeat. Stalin knew he needed to rearm. In terms of military equipment, he was determined to surpass Germany, and this would be the decisive factor in the Second World War. Stalin said, "This will be a battle of machines. It will be the one who produces more machines who will win." Stalin and several key leaders of the Red Army planned an initial attack. They believed that history indicated the Soviet inability to withstand German offensives, but the winter action had shown that their own offensives were working. Despite most of the military leadership, including Georgy Zhukov, advising to wait for the exhaustion of the German attack, Zhukov's opinion did not prevail. Strategic discussions also took place on the German side, with Erich von Manstein advocating a mobile defense that would yield ground and allow Soviet units to advance, while German forces would launch a series of sharp counterattacks against their flanks to inflict heavy losses. However, for political reasons, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler insisted that German forces go on the offensive, choosing the Kursk salient as the target. On April 15, 1943, the Führer authorized preparations for Operation Citadel. Operation Citadel proposed a double envelopment aimed at Kursk to encircle the Soviet defenders of 5 armies and isolate the salient. Von Manstein was a classic aristocratic Prussian officer. Manstein's entire family, on both sides, had been composed of soldiers. Therefore, he had the military ethos in his very bones. Erich von Manstein was someone who kept his emotions strictly under control, and Manstein also held a certain degree of snobbish disdain for Hitler, based entirely on social grounds. But they saw that they needed each other at some point, because they both needed to show that Germany could still win this war, and that they were invincible. Despite all this, Hitler remained resolute, placing his faith in the effectiveness of his new Tiger tanks to tip the balance in his favor. Meanwhile, kilometers away in the Soviet Union, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a man as tough as the Siberian winter, was meticulously planning a defensive strategy. Fully aware of the approaching storm, Zhukov intended to meet the enemy with a deep understanding of the art of war, knowing that every plan was merely a foundation for adaptation. At the center of Hitler's decisive Eastern offensive were what he called his wonder weapons. Hitler believed he held an ace up his sleeve for the operation against Kursk, and that ace was these new models of tanks. Leading the assault was the formidable Tiger I, the crown jewel of German armor. The Tiger tank went down in history as the best tank ever invented, invincible, powerful, the symbol of the battlefield. In early 1943, however, the Tiger was practically untested. It had seen limited action in North Africa and around Leningrad, but not much more. Kursk would be the ultimate test. With 100 millimeters of armor, the Tiger tank had an 88 millimeter gun mounted in its turret and could destroy an enemy tank from more than 1.6 kilometers away. It could not only pierce any enemy tank, it could literally blow its turret off. Another tank was also being produced, one so new it had never seen combat, the Panther. Hitler's goal was to flood the battlefield with a killing machine that was bigger, faster, and more accurate than the famous but aging Soviet T-34. And frankly, the T-34 might have been the best tank of the war in 1941 and 1942, but it was beginning to show its age, as every weapon system inevitably does over time. The Germans designed the Panther partly as a response to the T-34. During the preparations for Operation Citadel, Hitler's involvement in the production of these weapons intensified. Hitler became obsessed with the development of these machines, attending meetings and specifying exactly the features he wanted followed: the thickness of the frontal and side armor, the size of the gun, and the speed at which the vehicle should move. As we will see, the story of the Panther was marked by very real examples of mechanical problems during its combat debut. The engines of two Panthers caught fire just as they were leaving the railway cars, giving literal meaning to the phrase, "baptism by fire." The Panther was powerful, its gun was exceptional, its frontal armor decent, and these qualities made it an effective long-range destroyer. But the Panther's mechanical problems were beyond the automotive technology of the time. It was simply impractical to build a 45-ton medium battle tank with a 600 horsepower engine and neutral steering using mid-1940s German technology. The result was a tank that was greatly feared when it arrived on the battlefield, but was often found abandoned on the sides of roads in the war zones. Hitler was so convinced that these new tanks would give Germany the advantage in this offensive that he truly regarded them as decisive. Now, this is a great point to introduce the main figures of this colossal battle. Beginning with the Soviet side, Georgy Zhukov gained his first military experience under the Tsarist army during the First World War. In fact, he switched sides during the war and joined the Communists during the Revolution in 1917. Zhukov served in various positions after the war and became an early specialist in the use of armored forces. He managed to escape the purges of 1937, which cost the lives of many others. His first real success came against Japan at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, and he played a major role in the successful defense of Leningrad. Responsibility for the defense of Stalingrad was entrusted to him at the end of 1942, when he planned and executed the first major defeat of the German army. Zhukov was a hot-tempered man who intensely disapproved of those who failed in their duties. Konstantin Rokossovsky was a Soviet advisor during the Spanish Civil War. He was also involved in the purges of 1937. He escaped death but spent time in prison. He was recalled to service to help defend Moscow in 1941, and also commanded the Don Front during the Battle of Stalingrad. He commanded the Central Front during the Battle of Kursk. Pavel Rotmistrov was also an early advocate of tank warfare. He initially commanded the 7th Russian Tank Corps and was involved in the fighting around Rostov and Stalingrad, where he developed his tactical ideas. It was Rotmistrov who first suggested the use of formations composed solely of tanks. This tactic was adopted, and he later took command of the 5th Guards Tank Army. A highly capable commander, Rotmistrov had the appearance of a calm professor but possessed the mind and determination of a brilliant military strategist. Kurt Zeitzler served as an infantry soldier during the First World War and continued his military career during the interwar years. In 1934, he transferred to the newly created tank section, one of several changes implemented under Hitler's command. By 1939, he had achieved the rank of colonel, distinguishing himself in organization and mechanized warfare. He held various staff positions during the first 2 years of the war, and by 1942, he was serving in the West under von Rundstedt. Zeitzler played a significant role in the Allied defeat at Dieppe that year, which caught Hitler's attention. 1 month after that event, he was promoted to general and became chief of staff. Zeitzler's straightforward approach with older generals sometimes caused problems with fellow officers, as he always spoke his mind, even coming into conflict with Hitler on several occasions. He tried in vain to make Hitler see reason at Stalingrad. It was Zeitzler who drafted the plans for the offensive at Kursk and its pincer attacks. Although some other generals expressed concerns, Zeitzler enthusiastically promoted the plan, which was ultimately approved by Hitler. Its consequences would prove disastrous for Germany. Hermann Hoth, born on April 12, 1895, served in the First World War. He remained in the German army, and by 1936, Hoth was commander of a division. By 1942, Hoth was commander of the 4th Panzer Army and was engaged in the fighting at Stalingrad. His mission was to withdraw the 6th Army, which was encircled in the city, but the task was practically impossible, and he failed. Hoth and his 4th Panzer Army continued to be involved in the center of the fighting at Kursk. Army Group Center, under the command of von Klug, also played a significant role in the plans for Kursk. North of the salient, von Kluge's army group would operate the 9th Army, responsible for one of the 2 powerful maneuvers intended to annihilate the Soviet salient. Here is a super important figure of this battle. Walter Model also gained his first experiences during the First World War, reaching the rank of captain. Like von Manstein, he served in the interwar German army in various staff and field positions. He continued in several roles during the early stages of the Second World War, and by mid-1940, he had attained the rank of lieutenant general when he also received command of the 3rd Panzer Division. Although an infantryman at heart, he quickly made it his mission to explore the potential of tank warfare. Model constantly visited the front lines and always showed great concern for the welfare of his men. His division was involved in the titanic encirclement at Kiev and in the drives toward Moscow. Model firmly believed in the concept of blitzkrieg, and his successes did not go unnoticed by Hitler. By early 1942, he commanded the 9th Army with the rank of General of the Army. He was assigned to attack in the Rzhev sector in southern Russia. The bloody battles there would last almost a year, and by the spring of 1943, his 9th Army was well positioned to participate in the offensive at Kursk, specifically in the north. As the weeks went by, Hitler wanted to delay Operation Citadel. He himself was extremely nervous about it. Moreover, there was bad news regarding Hitler's so-called wonder weapons. The Panther was not truly ready for combat. It had not been properly tested, and the crews were inadequately trained and still unfamiliar with fighting at the battalion level. Meanwhile, the Tiger was proving slow to produce. The German offensive, initially planned to begin in early May, suffered several postponements as German leadership reconsidered its prospects and sought to bring in more units and equipment. Once Operations Order 6 was issued, indicating that the operation should be ready to start 6 days after April 28th, the 9th Army, tasked with commanding the offensive in the Army Group Center Zone, protested, claiming its deployment could not be completed before May 3rd. In a meeting on May 3rd, Hitler consulted several generals, and a discussion followed about the problems Model expected the 9th Army to face when trying to break through a well-fortified Soviet front and the inability of Panzer IV tanks to withstand new Soviet anti-tank weapons. Hitler ended the meeting without making a decision, but privately indicated to Model that there would be a delay. Most of the High Command opposed the postponement. Hitler decided to delay Operation Citadel until June, when he hoped to have the newer model tanks, Tiger I, available in sufficient quantity. On May 10th, Guderian was summoned to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin for a discussion about Panther tank production and possible delays in the program. After the conference, Guderian requested a private audience with Hitler. There, as reported in Guderian's memoirs, he asked the Führer, "Why do you want to attack in the east at all? How many people do you think even know where Kursk is? It is a matter of complete indifference to the world whether we hold Kursk or not. Why do we want to attack in the east this year?" Hitler replied, "You are absolutely right. Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns." Hitler assured Guderian that no firm commitment to the operation had yet been made. However, at a meeting of senior Nazi Party officials in May, Hitler compared the current situation on the Eastern Front to the party's dilemma in 1932, when it seemed headed for political defeat at the hands of Franz von Papen and Hindenburg. He declared, "In 1932, we achieved victory only through stubbornness that at times seemed madness. Thus we shall achieve it again today." Hitler's hesitation placed additional strain on his already tense relationship with his commander-in-chief, Erich von Manstein, who, with each passing week, grew increasingly anxious to carry out a successful attack. Manstein wanted to go sooner. Hitler wanted to go later. This was one of the most tense moments within the Wehrmacht High Command. For many, Hitler's indecision was yet another sign that he was far from the supreme commander he once had been. And that says a great deal about Hitler's mental state. Meanwhile, the gears of war began inexorably turning toward Kursk. While the Germans schemed their offensive, in the Soviet Union, preparations of another kind were underway. Warned by their network of spies, the Soviets were aware of the imminent threat to the Kursk salient. Instead of retreating, they decided to transform this perceived weakness into a formidable fortress. But how exactly did they know that? Here lies one of the super important points that explain this battle. 3 months earlier, and 3,000 kilometers away from the battlefields of Kursk, the brightest minds of the nation were deciphering secret messages from the Nazi war machine. Bletchley Park was filled with code breakers, mathematicians, and scientists. While the code breakers at Bletchley Park worked tirelessly to provide intelligence to the Western Allies, one of their colleagues, a quiet Scotsman educated at Cambridge named John Cairncross, was secretly gathering information for a very different purpose. John Cairncross was a British civil servant who became an intelligence officer and spy during World War II. As a Soviet double agent, he passed on to the Soviet Union the raw decrypts from Tunny, which had an enormous influence on the Battle of Kursk. Cairncross transmitted decrypted documents through secret channels to the Soviet Union. Nicknamed Liszt by the Russians due to his love of music, Cairncross was instructed to infiltrate Bletchley Park. Beginning in 1942, the German High Command communicated with the field commanders of the Army Group using a machine the British called Tunny. Cairncross smuggled Tunny decrypts out of Hut 3 in his trousers, transferring them to his briefcase at the railway station before meeting his NKVD contact in London. The decrypted Tunny transcripts provided British intelligence with advance information about Operation Citadel while it was still being planned. Almost all the original transcripts were destroyed at the end of the war, but one surviving transcript, dated April 25, 1943, from the German Army Group South, shows the high level of detail available to British intelligence officers. Analysts deduced the routes of attack from both the North and South, and a report based on that transcript was forwarded through official channels to Stalin. During this period, Cairncross provided a second clandestine channel, delivering raw Tunny transcripts directly. With Cairncross's information, the Soviet system of defenses built here was something completely unprecedented in history. The Soviets knew they were coming, and so they created defenses on a scale that had truly never been seen before in the war. People talk about the Maginot Line in France. This was the Maginot Line on steroids. Here, the full enormity of the Soviet defenses becomes clear. 3 defensive lines contained a vast interconnected web of thousands of anti-tank guns, pre-registered artillery zones, and over 400,000 mines. It was the largest defensive network ever built, stretching over 80 kilometers deep. The leader of this massive undertaking was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, known for his strategic insight and unshakable determination. Together with his generals, they developed a plan of staggering complexity, constructing a series of multi-layered defenses. Trenches were dug, minefields laid, and tank traps positioned. Villages and towns within the salient were turned into strong points, designed to resist and delay any German advance. The landscape itself was reshaped to serve the Soviet cause, transforming gentle hills and quiet ravines into hidden artillery positions and camouflaged tank emplacements. Each layer of defense was meticulously designed to exact a heavy toll on the advancing Germans, bleeding them dry through attrition. At the same time, the Red Army was being reinforced with more troops, tanks, and aircraft. New divisions were deployed, and their soldiers were trained to perfection for the coming battle. Zhukov and his fellow commanders, such as Konstantin Rokossovsky and Nikolai Vatutin, oversaw these preparations, ensuring that every soldier knew his duty and that every weapon was ready for action. In the quiet moments before the storm, the Kursk salient pulsed with anticipation. Every day, every hour was used to strengthen the Soviet position. They were preparing to face Hitler's citadel not with fear, but with a determination that would echo through history. Finally, the day arrived, July 5th, 1943. The Kursk salient, filled with defenses and the resolve of Soviet soldiers, waited. It was a trap ready to be sprung, a response to what seemed to be an inevitable clash. The Soviets had not only prepared, they had turned their defense into an art form. The Battle of Kursk was about to begin, and the Red Army was ready. During the night of July 4th to 5th, several German soldiers crossed the lines to surrender and informed the Soviets that the attack was imminent. Soviet aircraft and artillery opened fire to catch the Germans in their starting positions. For decades, this was the image accepted by both Soviet and Western historians, but it was not true. In reality, the Soviet artillery strikes were premature and caused little damage, and German fighters shot down 300 Soviet aircraft on the very first day. When the ground attack began on July 5th, the Germans broke through the first defensive belt in both the north and the south. At 12:35 p.m., with dust and smoke filling the air, the Battle of Kursk had truly begun, marking the start of an epic confrontation that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. Hitler's wonder weapons, for which he had been desperately waiting, were now ready and had just arrived at the front line. But the Germans paid a high price for Hitler's delay. The German attack was based on the classic blitzkrieg operation. The only disadvantage was that it lacked one key element: surprise. The Russians knew it was coming. The Germans retaliated by unleashing more shells than they had used in the French and Polish campaigns combined. German artillery answered with an even more massive bombardment, with an amount of ammunition never before used. It must have given the impression that now, finally, they were beginning a battle in which they would crush the Soviets. Leading the German attack on Kursk from the north was General Walter Model, nicknamed Hitler's fireman for his ability to rescue dire situations on the battlefield. Model was a truly difficult character. He was absolutely tough on himself, on his fellow officers, and on the troops under his command. You know, Hitler once turned to an associate while talking about Model and said, "Model, he'll get the job done, but I wouldn't want to serve under him." Model's directive for his 9th Army in the north was to break through the Soviet front line and advance 80 kilometers toward Kursk as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, in the south, under Manstein, the 4th Panzer Army would approach Kursk, covering a distance of 105 kilometers. The Germans planned to reach Kursk in no more than 10 days. At some point, the plan was for these two pincers to meet in the middle and cut off all Soviet forces inside the salient. On the first day of the battle, with support from the Luftwaffe and artillery, Model's troops in the north achieved initial success, managing to destroy 42 Soviet tanks, while losing only 2 of their own. Despite their early gains, the Germans, both in the north and south, soon faced a massive problem: the most formidable defenses of the Second World War. Tank traps, barbed wire, more than 500,000 mines, and over 4,800 kilometers of trenches. By the time the Germans attacked Kursk, it was the strongest fortress in the world. Because of the delay in launching the attack, the Germans assumed the Russians had strong defenses. However, they were still shocked to discover just how impressive those defenses truly were. The greatest difficulty the Germans faced in the north was the loss of time. As they tried to establish an effective offensive, they encountered considerable obstacles. The initial momentum they had met resistance as they ran into a solid defensive network. Countless engineers scoured the battlefield meticulously, identifying strategic points, fortifications, and trench communication systems. Even before the digging began, German generals like Model were already convinced that the Red Army's success in constructing such precise defenses could not be attributed solely to Hitler's delay. Making its debut at Kursk was another of Hitler's beloved weapons, the Ferdinand tank destroyer. The Ferdinand had no turret, but it featured a massive 88mm gun with a range of about 2.5 kilometers to destroy enemy tanks. During the design phase, the need for a short-range defensive machine gun was neglected. The suspension was not adequate to support the tank destroyer's weight, causing the vehicle to bog down easily. During the northern attack on Kursk by Model's 9th Army, for example, the lack of secondary armament proved to be a real problem. When the enemy got close, the crew had no means of defending themselves. These flaws ensured that the Ferdinand's debut on the battlefield was a failure. 40 of the 80 machines that took part in the battle were lost to the enemy within the first 3 days. And if we look at the entire war, only 2 of these monsters survived after 1945. The T-34 was the pride of the Red Army. Although it could not match the Tiger in firepower or armor, it was reliable, agile, and produced in staggering numbers. The Soviet tank crews, hearts pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination, gripped the controls of their T-34s. They knew the challenge they were facing. The landscape around Kursk soon echoed with the roar of these mechanical beasts. As the German tanks advanced, they were met by a hail of fire from hidden, well-camouflaged T-34s, or ambushed within the labyrinth of Soviet defenses. The initial clashes were brutal, Tigers prowling, T-34s weaving a deadly dance, punctuated by the flashes of gunfire and the smoke rising from smoldering tanks. Amid the chaos, heroes emerged on both sides. The famous German tank commander Michael Wittmann, as we will see later, known for his tactical skill and audacity, was one of them. Despite the formidable challenge, the T-34s held their ground against the Tigers. This was a testament to their design, the bravery of their crews, and the strategic planning of leaders like Zhukov. The Battle of Kursk was far from over, and the duel between Tigers and T-34s was only the opening act of this vast armored drama. Among the highest ranks, figures like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Nikolai Vatutin stood as pillars of strategic insight and leadership. Their meticulous planning, combined with their faith in their soldiers, played a significant role in keeping the German advance at bay. In contrast, figures like Adolf Hitler and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein were seen as the architects of the ill-conceived Operation Citadel. Their insistence on pursuing the offensive despite the obvious risks revealed the fatal flaw in their strategic thinking. Their misguided judgment turned the battle into a quagmire for their troops, earning them the dubious distinction of being the villains of this chapter in history. Nowhere was this intelligence more apparent than on the battlefields of Ponyry, a village with a key railway station just 45 miles north of Kursk. Despite facing vast defenses, Model was convinced that if his 9th Army could break through at Ponyry, Kursk would be theirs. Model's forces advanced very slowly, only 20 kilometers in a week. The focus of the battle was the road leading to Kursk. This was the main artery along which Model was operating. And this obscure little place in the Soviet Union became the focal point of Model's push southward, and of the Soviet determination to stop the Germans from reaching Kursk. Rail lines were always of great importance, and the station at Ponyry was a crucial point. The Soviets had prepared especially for a fight in this area. On July 6th, the Germans and the Red Army clashed in one of the bloodiest battles on the Eastern Front. Here in Ponyry, it was a bloodbath. You had to fight to the death. And when you told that to Soviet soldiers, they did. German soldier Walter Wolff, who fought at Kursk, recalled an equally grim order from the German High Command. Our orders were, take no prisoners and save the last bullet for yourself. You will not go to a prisoner of war camp. As we already know, war in the East was of a different kind than war in the West. It was existential. Everyone understood that it was a war of extermination. Model's advance from the north is stalled and far from Kursk. As Operation Citadel collapses, Hitler himself also begins to fall apart. Having been so confident in victory and in his new weapons, upon hearing the news of the defeat in the north, Hitler felt deeply crushed. He could not understand what was happening. Not only did he begin to change psychologically, but he also started to deteriorate physically. He was weaker and began to isolate himself, both from the High Command and from the German people and the soldiers who represented him. Due to his physical and mental condition, Hitler came under the constant medical care of his most trusted physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. Morell was not popular within Hitler's inner circle, who complained about his crude table manners, poor hygiene, and body odor. It is said that Hitler replied, "I don't employ him for his aroma, but to take care of my health." Hermann Göring called Morell the Reich Master of Injections, implying that Morell resorted to using injections whenever faced with medical problems, and that he used them excessively, even when unnecessary. After successfully treating Hitler for stomach cramps in 1936, Hitler hired Morell as his full-time personal physician, a position he would hold for the next 9 years. Hitler was a chronic hypochondriac and claimed to suffer from all sorts of ailments, from vision problems to chronic stomach pains, diarrhea, gas, and eczema. Morell kept a medical diary of the drugs, tonics, vitamins, and other substances he administered to Hitler, usually via injection, up to 20 times a day, or in pill form. Most were commercial preparations, while others were Morell's own concoctions. Since some of these compounds are considered toxic, historians have speculated that Morell may have inadvertently contributed to the deterioration of Hitler's health. The list of around 74 substances, in 28 different mixtures, administered to Hitler included psychoactive drugs such as heroin, as well as commercial poisons. Interestingly, Morell was trained as a general practitioner. However, his specialty was not dermatology or venereology, but actually obstetrics and gynecology. As Hitler's drug addiction grew, the northern assault on Kursk came to a complete halt, as we saw earlier. Any remaining hope of victory now rested solely on Manstein's units in the south. On the southern face of the salient, the Germans made better progress. While the advance in the north was about 16 kilometers, in the south it was 3 times greater. Leading the southern advance was Commander Hermann Hoth of the 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the infamous Totenkopf Division. This was Hitler's elite, and whenever the Waffen-SS appeared in a sector of the battlefield, one could be sure that these were Germany's divisions at full strength. On July 11th, Hoth's and Manstein's units were just 80 kilometers from Kursk, gathering around the sleepy village of Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, Stalin's mechanized units were rushing to defend the area. Even though it was a small town, it was of great importance, because if it were captured, every road to Kursk would be open. Many historians consider the battle that took place at Prokhorovka to be the largest tank battle in history, since Kursk was an absurdly large front with many more localized engagements. At 6:30 in the morning on July 12th, 7 days after the start of the Battle of Kursk, the first tanks began to roll toward each other. Literally, German columns moved eastward, while Soviet columns advanced westward. Through the morning fog, a brutal battle of steel against steel began. Over the next 24 hours, more than 1,000 armored vehicles and anti-tank guns would engage in one of the greatest tank battles in history. While ground forces were supported by aerial combat above, moving through the smoke and carnage across the fields were Hitler's much-praised Tiger tanks. There were very few Tiger tanks, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in strength and capability, especially against the Soviet T-34s, which were worn out and outdated. For comparison, the T-34 could fire only twice per minute, while the Tiger could fire 6 to 7 times per minute, and the T-34's maximum effective range was about 1 kilometer, whereas the Tiger's was 3 kilometers. This meant that while the Russian tanks were moving, the Germans had more time to aim. As a result, a single Tiger could destroy several enemy tanks in the same amount of time. Commanding a platoon of Tiger tanks was Michael Wittmann, a 29-year-old Panzer ace mentioned earlier. He was credited with destroying 138 tanks and 132 anti-tank guns, along with an unknown number of other armored vehicles, making him one of Germany's greatest Panzer aces. Here at Kursk, he was responsible for destroying at least 30 T-34 tanks. They found themselves facing hundreds of enemy tanks charging over the hills. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Tigers remained incredibly calm. When the Soviet army was about 1 kilometer away, Wittmann and the other Tiger commanders gave the order to open fire, and one by one, they began to take down the Soviet tanks, effectively destroying their formation. For the first time in the war, the Germans deployed tanks that technologically surpassed the famous Russian T-34, and those tanks were the Tigers. The Germans may have had the best tanks, as well as an elite fighting force, but as the Battle of Prokhorovka unfolded, Hitler's men realized they were facing an overwhelming obstacle. German tank commanders described seeing hundreds of tanks swarming across the battlefield. At Prokhorovka, it became clear that Stalin had mass-produced far more than the Germans. They defeated one unit, and another came, and then another, and another, and they wondered, how much equipment and how many tanks do they still have? They just never stopped coming. This was clearly a far stronger army than they had ever imagined. The origins of Stalin's abundance of resources can be traced back 2 years earlier. Lend-Lease was the program through which the United States provided, on loan, to the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and other allied nations, weapons and other supplies between 1941 and 1945. The program was signed into law on March 11, 1941. A year and a half after the outbreak of World War II in Europe, but 9 months before the U.S. entered the war in December 1941. Formally titled An Act to Further Promote the Defense of the United States, the law ended the pretense of American neutrality. Each voyage took between 10 and 15 days, while most ships were under constant attack by German aircraft, submarines, and warships. The Arctic route was the shortest and most direct path for aid to reach the USSR, though it was also the most dangerous. Now, prepare for the list. Between June 1941 and May 1945, the following were sent to the USSR: 3,000 plus Hurricane aircraft, 4,000 plus other aircraft, 27 warships, 5,218 tanks, 5,000 plus anti-tank guns, 4,020 ambulances and trucks, 323 machinery trucks, 1,721 motorcycles, 1.1 million pounds worth of aircraft engines, 1,474 radar sets, 4,338 radio sets, and 15 million pairs of boots. Approximately 3,964,000 tons of goods were transported via the Arctic convoys, of which 7% were lost, while 93% arrived safely. This accounted for about 23% of all aid to the USSR during the war. But Stalin's colossal abundance was also the result of massive internal changes carried out within Russia itself. The initial German advance threatened not only Soviet territories and factories, but also the total collapse of the nation's civilian economy. Despite contingency plans from the 1930s and the formation of evacuation committees in 1941, most evacuations were coordinated by local Soviet organizations responding to imminent industrial threats from German attacks. The State Defense Committee, GKO, oversaw the relocation of more than 1,500 factories of military importance to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. These regions offered safety to inhabitants due to their remote locations and provided Soviet industries with an enormous amount of resources for factories tied to the war effort. The Urals, in central Russia, developed an impressive array of iron and steel plants, along with agricultural and chemical industries. Siberian industries relied on coal mines to sustain the Soviet war machine. Some evacuations and transfers of machinery and skilled workers to shadow factories in the east had begun much earlier. The U.S. military attaché reported significant transfers of machinery and personnel from the Moscow area to the east in late 1940 and early 1941. The rapid growth in production in early 1942 suggests that the evacuation had begun in 1940. Back on the battlefield at Prokhorovka, despite being massively outnumbered by the Soviets in both men and material, the German elite units achieved the unthinkable. In just 24 hours, they managed to destroy over 380 enemy tanks, losing only about 50 of their own. Meanwhile, the battlefield claimed nearly 4,000 Red Army casualties compared to only 937 German losses. Despite the Germans putting on a show at Prokhorovka, there is debate about the meaning and outcome of the battle. The German forces destroyed many Soviet tanks and temporarily degraded the 5th Guards Tank Army's striking power, but they failed to take Prokhorovka or break through to open ground before developments elsewhere forced the termination of Operation Citadel. On the Soviet side, the massive armored assault of July 12th failed to destroy the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, but it succeeded in exhausting the Germans and eventually helped to halt their advance. Thus, neither the 5th Guards Tank Army nor the 2nd SS Panzer Corps achieved their objectives on July 12th. One day earlier, on July 11th, the forces of the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom landed in Sicily during Operation Husky. Hitler summoned Günther von Kluge and von Manstein to his Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia and declared his intention to cancel Operation Citadel. Operation Husky itself was launched in perfect coordination among the Allied forces with the purpose of weakening the German offensive by forcing troop redeployments to Sicily. Some German units immediately departed for Italy, and only limited attacks continued in the south. While Manstein was making progress in the south, the Soviets launched a powerful and unexpected counterattack against Model's already weakened troops in the north. Let's understand exactly how this counteroffensive took place. As the Battle of Kursk unfolded, the attention of the Red Army wasn't solely focused on defense behind the lines. At 1804, a plan was being crafted, a plan that would change the course of the battle and bring the Germans to their knees. Named after the historic Russian prince, famed for his military prowess, Operation Kutuzov was the Soviet response to the German advance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, with his unshakable determination, led this counteroffensive, ready to make his next move like an experienced chess master. The first signs of the Soviet counteroffensive were subtle, but on July 12th, the true nature of Operation Kutuzov was revealed. The Soviets launched a massive attack on the German salient north of Kursk, backed by a thunderous artillery barrage, with the intent of reclaiming lost territory. Simultaneously, the German commanders were caught off guard. Operation Citadel had stretched their resources to the limit, and they were unprepared to face a significant Soviet offensive. Operation Kutuzov marked a turning point in the Battle of Kursk, the moment when the Red Army seized the initiative, shifting from defense to offense. It was the beginning of the end for the Germans, a blow from which they would never fully recover. As Operation Kutuzov progressed and the Soviets regained territory, a growing sense of despair began to take hold within the German High Command. Operation Citadel, their grand plan to encircle and destroy a large portion of the Red Army, was collapsing before their very eyes. The Kursk salient had turned from an opportunity into a quagmire. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, once confident in a swift victory, now faced a grim reality. His panzer divisions, though filled with formidable tigers and panthers, were not invincible. They were bogged down, facing not only a fortified enemy, but also an aggressive counterattack. The grim spectacle of burning German tanks in the fields around Kursk was a sight that shook the German command to its core. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler faced a dilemma. His Eastern Front was in disarray, and the news from Kursk was far from encouraging. Moreover, as we have seen, an additional crisis had just unfolded. The Allies had landed in Sicily, opening yet another front in the war. Hitler now faced a difficult choice. Should he continue the increasingly fruitless operation at Kursk, or withdraw his forces to respond to the new threat? On July 13th, Hitler ordered the cancellation of Operation Citadel. This was a significant development, a tacit admission of defeat. The German forces at Kursk were ordered to withdraw, disengaging from a battle they could no longer win. As news of the withdrawal spread, a sense of disbelief swept through the German troops. Marshal von Manstein, faced with defeat, adopted a pragmatic judgment by recognizing the transformation of the Red Army into a formidable enemy. Abandoning the old blitzkrieg strategies, he opted for defense in depth as a crucial adaptation. Recognizing the Red Army's superior numbers and improved tactics, German commanders began organizing their forces into multiple defensive lines. This layered defense was designed to absorb the momentum of Soviet attacks, wear down their forces, and provide opportunities for counterattacks. Another change was the enhanced focus on anti-tank warfare. The Battle of Kursk had revealed the growing strength of Soviet armored divisions. To counter this, the Germans improved their anti-tank weapons and tactics. The Germans understood that the interaction between infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support was crucial for success. On the battlefield, they sought to improve coordination among different units, ensuring that each element effectively supported the others. However, these tactical adaptations were no panacea. They were desperate measures, responses to a bleak situation. Although they brought temporary relief and localized successes, they could not reverse the overall strategic situation. The German army, once the master of the Eastern Front, was now on the defensive, facing an enemy that had finally found its stride. After 50 days of combat, the Battle of Kursk was finally over. There was nothing more the Germans could do from this point onward to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Furthermore, the loss convinced Hitler of the incompetence of his general staff. When given the chance, his generals had selected a poor plan, and he decided to make sure it would never happen again. The opposite applied to Stalin, however. After seeing his general's intuition justified on the battlefield, he withdrew from strategic planning and left it entirely to the military. Predictable results followed on both sides. The German army suffered loss after loss, as Hitler personally attempted to micromanage the day-to-day operations of what soon became a war on 3 fronts, while the Soviet army gained more freedom and became increasingly fluid as the war went on. The Battle of Kursk remains a subject of historical debate due to the uncertainty surrounding Soviet losses, whose exact figures will likely remain unknown. It is estimated that at least 1.2 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded, with the destruction of 7,000 tanks and assault guns, as well as the loss of 3,000 aircraft. The Germans, in turn, suffered about 203,000 losses among the dead, wounded, and missing, along with the destruction of 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and the loss of 650 aircraft. Despite the higher Soviet losses, the Battle of Kursk represented a serious defeat for the Germans. Hitler, aiming for a victory at Kursk to demonstrate the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, obtained the opposite result. For the first time, The Red Army halted a German summer offensive within a few days and, despite the enormous losses, launched its own offensive along the Eastern Front. The defeat at Kursk exhausted German combat power in the east by the end of the summer of 1943, when they could no longer replace their losses. Moreover, German civilian morale suffered severe blows, shifting from a belief in possible military victory over the USSR to gradual decline. The attitudes of German soldiers toward Soviet civilians also intensified, especially during the retreat from Ukraine beginning in 1943, when locals were confronted with the choice of marching west with the Germans or facing summary execution. This was not an exception, but rather the rule in almost every situation. On the Soviet side, the victory at Kursk strengthened their confidence despite the heavy losses. The Red Army demonstrated that it could not only withstand the German attack, but also successfully launch its own offensives. Leaders such as Marshal Georgy Zhukov emerged from the battle with enhanced reputations, their names etched into the annals of Soviet military history. With a renewed sense of purpose, the Soviets launched a series of offensives after Kursk. The failure of Operation Citadel convinced Hitler to focus more resources on the Western Front. Meanwhile, in Italy, dictator Benito Mussolini received the news with growing unease. The German ally, once seemingly invincible, had been checked in the east, and Mussolini could not ignore the implications for his own fascist regime. His fears were justified. Less than a month after Kursk, in Berlin, where the shockwaves of Kursk were felt most intensely, Adolf Hitler, once supremely confident of victory, now had to confront a bitter reality. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Western Allies were preparing for an invasion. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was slipping away, replaced by the specter of imminent defeat. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, saw an opportunity in the outcome of Kursk. The failures of the German army in the east opened a gap for the planned invasion of Normandy, also meaning that fewer German divisions would be available to counter the imminent landing in 1944. Despite the passage of time, myths and controversies surrounding the Battle of Kursk persist. Debates about the scale of the battle and the actual number of tanks involved, as well as the strategic decisions made by leaders on both sides, continue to engage historians and enthusiasts. These discussions, far from diminishing the importance of Kursk, seem to enhance its fascination, ensuring that the battle continues to captivate minds and stimulate debate. Every year, on July 12th, a reenactment of the Battle of Prokhorovka takes place, gathering military enthusiasts and historians from around the world. The roar of engines and the thunder of tracks serve as a haunting reminder of the chaos and carnage that once consumed the now peaceful fields. Employing massed force, using the effects of overwhelming combat power at the decisive place and moment, is an important part of modern warfare. Neither during the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, nor in the 1942 campaign, did the Germans follow this principle at a strategic level. Long before the start of the attack on the Kursk salient, the Germans knew that the Soviets were aware of their intentions. Instead of changing the plan, or even seeking a decisive battle on a much larger scale, Hitler adhered to the original plan. For this to succeed, it would have been necessary for the German army to expose its forces in other theaters of war, including a timely withdrawal from Africa. But this type of thinking was foreign to Hitler, who was risk-averse in two ways. He refused to conduct maneuver warfare, which was only possible through temporary yielding of ground. Moreover, he hesitated to expose his forces on lateral fronts or theaters of war in favor of the point where the decision should be made, as long as any residual risk remained. At Kursk, mass concentration did not occur. Hitler was unwilling to deploy additional forces to the east for the imminent battle at Kursk. He even failed to specify a main effort at one of the attack's flanks. The German failure at Kursk had several reasons, but perhaps the main one was the lack of surprise. Despite the absence of surprise, however, Operation Citadel failed primarily because German leadership, specifically Hitler, cancelled it before a decision could be reached. This decision defied all logic. When Hitler withdrew considerable forces to Italy at that time, it was already too late to prevent the Allied landing, condemning any possibility of success at Kursk. If Citadel had continued, heavy Soviet casualties would have been highly probable. With just a few additional infantry divisions, the offensive could have achieved rapid success. Additional infantry divisions could have relieved the first German breakthrough forces and confronted Soviet counterattacks. Of course, in terms of timing, Citadel started too late. If it had begun at the end of May, or at the latest, in early June, its chance of success would have been considerably higher. Moreover, the Soviets would have been struck before they could fully re-establish their operational capabilities. But even a German success at Kursk would not have decisively changed the situation, either on the Eastern Front or in favor of Hitler's Reich. The overall balance of forces was simply against Germany. The subsequent course of the war on the Eastern Front shows that the Soviets were so superior in numbers of soldiers and material that they could have sustained multiple defeats, like Kursk, without losing their offensive capability. For successful operational conduct, in terms of strategic defense, Hitler would have had to be willing to take greater risks, not only in relation to temporary yielding of space, but also regarding the employment of forces. For this, other theaters of war in Norway, France, and the Balkans would have had to be reduced, thus accepting a high strategic risk. The alternative, strategic offensive, was no longer possible after Kursk due to the balance of forces. Forced into strategic defense, Hitler decided to hold the occupied areas at all costs. The consequence was a series of wars of attrition, which could not be won due to the overwhelming superiority of personnel and material of the Soviets. To conclude, we can understand even more deeply the full scope by visualizing the problems of German command units. Take a look at this here. Although the Wehrmacht faced problems related to command unity, some of Manstein's proposals contributed significantly to command cohesion. By dissolving Army Group B, dividing its forces and area of responsibility between Army Groups Center and South, the Oberkommando ensured command unity for the most threatened section of the Eastern Front. Manstein was able to concentrate his combat power toward the common objective of closing the gap and defeating the attacking Soviet forces. On the other hand, command unity was not ensured for Citadel at the operational level on the front line. Resolving this issue was beyond Manstein's control. The supreme commander was Hitler, with his headquarters in Germany. This was a considerable disadvantage because he could not receive immediate and direct impressions from the battlefield. Furthermore, communication between Hitler and the commanders of the army groups was difficult and complicated. Thus, commanders were forced to travel repeatedly to Hitler's headquarters. Additionally, it became clear that Hitler was seriously overburdened due to his dual responsibility as political leader and the sole true unified commander. Since he was neither willing nor able to delegate, the war imposed extraordinary demands on him in political, military, social, and economic fields. Moreover, in crisis situations, Hitler tended to command even individual battalions. As a result, inefficiency and discontinuity often characterized his decisions. The situation was further exacerbated in the military field, since responsibilities for the different theaters of war were divided between the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, responsible for all theaters of war except the East, and the Oberkommando des Heer, responsible only for the East. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.